Welcome, guys, to the Solo GP Playbook panel. My name is Nikola. I'm going to be your moderator today. We have an amazing lineup of panelists here. We have Gideon from Andrena Ventures. We've got Severin from New Renaissance Ventures. And we've got Anthony from Rerail. They have an amazing experience coming from the venture capital world, from big global companies they've worked in, and all of them today are solo GPs, meaning investors in VC funds where they are the only partners, not just the only team members. They do have team members, but the only partners. Before we get into the questions, I want to get a bit of a read on the audience with a few questions. With a raise of hand, which of you is a startup founder? Okay. Which ones of you are investors? Okay, great. Which ones of you are planning to become investors, to launch a VC fund? Okay, great. That's awesome. We have these people here. Great, okay. I suggest we kick it off with a quick question. It's to all of you guys, and it's the following. All of you had pretty good setups before that. You've worked at VC funds, Entre Capital, Speed Invest. You've worked at some multinational, huge, awesome companies, fast-growing. What made you do the leap into venture capital as a solo GP? Was it a different thesis? Was it the economics? Was it something else? We can start with Gideon, as he's the farthest. We could be a bit short here, like several sentences.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. For me, it was really about what I thought founders needed in Europe. Small, angel-like investors that could be early and quick, but who were fully focused on supporting them and building a business out of doing that.
Awesome. Severin?
Yeah, not an economic decision, I can tell you that. Very much driven by a thesis, realizing that Sequoias and index ventures of the world are already investing quite significant amounts of money into creative tech companies, but they don't really have a category for that. And there is no early stage venture ecosystem for creative tech founders out there, and that's what I'm building with New Renaissance Ventures.
Nice, thank you.
And for myself, can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
And for myself, just before I spent a year back to operating, and that's where I saw, while I was angel investing, I had a very compounding positioning between the fintech networks, which are my core, I could bring to the table in the collaboration with the VC. So I felt by creating my own entity, I could kind of have a structure that optimizes for that spike and outperforms.
Nice. Like an interesting thing about the venture capital world is that every VC fund has a different thesis, and it's pretty much the same with solo GPs. Up next, I want to get a bit deeper into the process of raising a VC fund, because if operating a VC fund is hard, raising one is definitely even harder. And I imagine as a solo GP, this could be times harder than if you're at a team with GPs. Gideon, I want to start from you. In your case, you have some pretty prominent names as LPs backing you. You have the A16Z FinTech GP, you have the Wise founders guys, you have other amazing people there. My question would be, how did the first 10 conversations look like? And what did it take for the first yes to get?
Thank you. So the first thing I'll say is don't let the big names fool you. It was very difficult. Fundraising as a first-time manager with limited track record is tough. For me, the key insight was that kind of saved me early on, was that I realized I would get good support from the founders and operators that I had worked with before, and I'd also get good support from people in the VC ecosystem who wanted to collaborate with me. So these were, longer-term relationships and strategic relationships. It was actually very difficult to raise initially from professional LPs who were like financial return driven. And I really had to use the capital that I raised from the founders, operators, and VCs to prove to the professional LPs that I could get into good deals and show at least some early signals of being able to generate high returns, and then was fortunate later on in my process in the final close to get some of the more professional LPs. So, you know, I had to just be ruthless about spending my time with the types of people that were actually going to give me money to get going, and not waste my time with, you know, with the people that you typically do want to raise from, but wouldn't give me money initially.
So it's like a lot of focus on the people you know that they're weighted a bit more there. Anthony, in your case, you've oversubscribed the 20 million of a fund. And I just wanted to be sure that I'm asking the right question. And my question here would be, was there a moment, because that's a big fund for a solo GP, was there a moment where it was like a turning point for you, where you're like, okay, if I don't make it that far, then I just scrap the idea and I go back to other plans?
So I'd say firstly that it sounds easy, but I go back to what Gideon said, like it was hard. I also say that I had the benefit of having raised a fund before. So this is the first of Rerail, but it's the second fund that I was raising. And that's something that actually, like the more institutional LPs like to see, so it was slightly easier. But I did something controversial, which is I said instead of going after the people that convert easily, and I wanted the big chunk of my LP to be, again, founders and operators, because I think they're, you know, very valuable to the journey. I said, like, let's start actually from the ones that take the longest to convert, like the institutional investors, etc., which was a bet. And then in parallel, I was talking to some of those GPs who can be super connectors. And what happened was, the inflection point was that I was lucky to have two of the institutional LPs anchor the funds. And when that happens, it becomes much easier, because a lot of the other conversations you have, they tell you, you know, I'll come back to you after you do your first close, or let me know how it goes. And so that really helped. I went out to raise in February 24, which I guess was trough of fundraise market. I did the first close at just above my target, which was 20.5 in July, and then closed at a hard cap of 25. I must say that right before I got the anchor LPs, it was just a grind, and I was much more below the target. So
how much time did it took?
So 6 months to first close above target, and then 9 months for hard cap.
From beginning of conversations. Nice. Severin, in your case, you've been head of fundraising at Speed Invest before that, and you've raised over 700 million in LP money for the different funds of Speed Invest. How is raising for a brand different than raising for yourself as a brand, as a person?
Very different. So just for context, so the 700 million from Speed Invest is across 3 funds, and that's obviously a very institutional fundraising machine. So you could compare it probably with like SME sales versus enterprise sales, while Speed Invest was very much enterprise sales and board meetings in large asset allocators in London or in government funds in Luxembourg. Whereas raising for your own microfund is tapping into your trusted network and the ecosystem you've built over the years. And it's more like having lunches with high net worth individuals and having 2 or 3 lunches with the same person that they finally come in with a 100K ticket. So it is a very different sales experience at the end of the day, because it is just a sales process, right? But it's a very different kind of experience in terms of selling. But where there are synergies is actually the process. So I learned a lot about like the process of fundraising, and that probably saved me a lot of time because I knew from the very beginning where not to go and what to avoid, and had a very clear idea of who could be my potential LPs in my fund.
Yeah, and I guess like the experience with the over 700 million helped a lot, like to get the strategy, the structure, and everything that you would implement later in the solo GP fund. We covered a bit of the raising the fund, and now I want to get a bit deeper into operating a solo GP. And Severin, I'm just going to continue with you here. In our initial conversations between 4 of us, you mentioned the solo GP tech stack, and I think people here might be curious to hear how does a solo GP tech stack look like? That's a question we start with you, but Gideon, Anthony, feel free to join in because I think it's going to be interesting for people to get an insight on that.
Sure. I mean, I think I'm not reinventing the wheel here. That being said, I'm a Google fanboy, probably because I worked there for a couple of years, so I'm very locked into Google products. I'm probably one of a few VCs who's not working with Claude, but working with Google Anti-Gravity. But it does the job for me.
So is it Gemini instead of Claude then? Or?
Of course, I use Gemini, yeah.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. There is no OpenAI Anthropic products in my suite. Anyways, but it's the same in the end. That helps a lot. And I think what the big advantage as a solo GP is that you can leverage those tools in very different ways because there is always 100% context memory, right? Because it's just you basically inputting the data and orchestrating it. So there's no kind of break between teams or team members. So that's very, very powerful. And AI is obviously a superpower here. And in terms of rather new tools I'm using, I think the last one where I really had like the feel of a productivity boost was Granola AI note-taking tool.
Okay, nice.
And the rest is pretty much standard, I guess.
Yeah. Gideon, Anthony, something to add as a tech stack?
I mean, not too much to add. I think like we joke a little bit sometimes about the Holy Trinity, Claude, Attio, and Granola. You know, between those three, along with connecting to your email and so on, I think as a solo GP, we've been able to automate a lot of workflows. It's never been a better time to be solo because you get so much support from tools like that.
You don't need to hire an associate.
Okay.
No, but I think like I had a lot of point solution automations, and once Claude Cowork kind of released, it kind of just created a unified like automation of like almost a human.
Yeah. In terms of running a solo GP, Gideon, your case is a bit specific because you are investing in fintech alumni who do spin-outs. And this means you rely very heavily on your personal network. My question would be, how does managing the inflow and scouting of founders look like as a solo GP? How do you systemize the entire process and make sure you're not the single point of, so to say, failure in the system?
So I think to some extent you want systemization, and to some extent maybe you don't as well, right? Because some of the most unique opportunities come from these like weird and wonderful situations where, you know, someone you helped 8 years ago start a company that you didn't back, and you know, built a company, and then the star employee is now starting the next company, and all of a sudden you kind of get your money back because you get referenced as the investor to talk to. So those situations are difficult to systematize, and part of the appeal of being solo is that you get to leverage your unique network in these like unsystematizable ways, if that makes sense. But to answer your question, for me, like what it really comes down to is long-term, high-trust relationships with just a great set of founders, operators, and angel investors. And if there is a way to systematize it, for me, it's actually about not being transactional and just focusing on building relationships with good people, people that are very good at what they do, who are real experts, and you just stay in touch with them. You're not going to them to source a deal. You're going to them to catch up and see how they're doing in their life and how they think about their career. And if they're starting a company, or their friends or colleagues or ex-colleagues are starting a company, you'll generally be one of the first people they'll want to talk to. And so by just having a group of good people that you have long-term high-trust relationships with, you create this machine, for lack of a better word, of deal flow that, you know, some might call proprietary, or at least will give you an advantage out there in terms of sourcing.
I love that. Anthony, board seats. You've got the biggest portfolio of the three. First would be, do you as a solo GP take board seats? And if you do, how do you manage many board seats as a solo GP? And what is like, when is it too much to manage?
Yeah, so I don't do board seats. I actually think that board has a role to play as companies scale up in terms of governance, but most of the valuable work with the founders doesn't happen in the board. I think I make sure and I try my best to be the first point of contact of those founders. The benefit we have by being small and collaborative is that we're the person that founders can come to us with, like, being vulnerable with, and where, there's always interest alignment, because they're not always like pitching to us on whether we're going to do their next round or so. And so the number one focus I try to do is, like, can I be that person for them, the person that adds most value that they can be vulnerable with? Once that's the case, then it's about kind of establishing the right means of comms. So, like, we're in WhatsApp ad hoc, we can do ad hoc calls, we're async. A lot of the value I try to bring to the table can be systematized partly, but not really, because a lot of it is connectivity, but some of it is emotional support, for example. So I'll turn your question into how do you scale that portfolio support in some respects, which I think, that's the brutal truth is, you back a company at pre-seed seed, some of them won't make it to the next round, and that's organic. Some of them will, and the ones that do, the amount they need you ramps down, right? So I have a company that I backed back in pre-seed called Primer that just raised 100 million rounds.
Congrats.
Thank you. They haven't yet, like, they don't need me on the day-to-day. I'm there if they want me to. But for, like, when there's vulnerable points of discussion and things to talk about, I'm still the point of contact. That's not scalable, but that's great, because that's fewer people, and it's the reason why when Gabriel, the CEO, knows someone he really rates that starts a new company, he's going to come to me. Or where I'm trying to prove my value to companies before I'm trying to win a deal, like Gabriel is very happy to talk to them and tell them what I do for him. And so, to answer your question, it should organically basically scale by means of graduation of companies, but also the fact that I don't do internal meetings with a bunch of team, the fact that I don't do long board meetings, and a lot of the interactions I have, I try to maximize just impact. It just means you can do more, basically.
Understood. Nice. On the last question on the topic of running the fund, with just 1 to 2 sentences answer for each of you, we can start with Anthony. What was the first role, the first person you hired to do something with you in the solo GP fund? It could be full-time, part-time. Which is the first role you got support for?
I haven't hired anyone yet. So Claude Cowork would be my answer. But I'm thinking about it. It is a very important shift, because suddenly you have to dedicate energy towards managing people. And a lot of it is about the craft of venture and spending most of my time supporting my portfolio and meeting new companies. But it might happen over time.
Nice. Severin?
Yeah, I personally think the biggest leverage is in hiring, like, communications, content, marketing personally. That's also where I, like, in-source resources early on. I just recently did my first full-time hire, so to say, and I was very sensitive about this, because I didn't want to hire someone like part-time or just for 6 months, because as a solo GP you have this kind of 0 to 1 setup cost, in a way, coordination cost, and you don't want to do that investment if that person is not full-time and for a longer time. So I did that jump now, that kind of 0 to 1 jump in hiring the first full-time person. And yeah, that's great, and love the experience.
Nice.
So yeah, also no team, but the closest thing I've done to that is incentivize scouts, again, lack of a better word, who are really just founders and operators who I see as key nodes in the ecosystem, to be involved in the fund in different ways, either to help with sourcing, to help as experts that help the founders I back, or just to be general advisors to me. And so I have just a great group of people, again, that I've known for a long time, who I trust, who have vested interest to contribute to the fund, but their full-time job is typically building a different company.
So we've covered the raising part, we've covered the operating part. Now we'll get a bit into the deciding as a solo GP part. No investment committee, or is there or isn't there? How do you stress test your decisions the moment you have to actually make the final decision and do the call? Gideon, we can start from you.
You don't, you just write the check. No, I'm joking.
You don't overthink it too much.
Don't overthink it. So I'm joking, but there's an element of truth in that, which is that when you're doing pre-seed and seed investing, it's such a kind of high conviction and counter consensus game that, you know, unlike traditional investing, you do need an element of boldness and being willing to do something that maybe looks irrational now, but could turn into an incredible opportunity. And, you know, anyone that's read the stories of how Airbnb and Uber and companies like this started would kind of understand what I'm saying, because those all sounded a bit crazy and needed an investor that probably wasn't overthinking those ideas too much to write the first check. So there's kind of an element of truth in that, and having the autonomy to be bold and take those crazy bets can actually be a huge advantage. But to answer your question, to stay sane and sanity check your thinking, and also importantly to make sure you're not missing important facts about the market or the founder. As solo GPs, our strategies are collaborative, which means we're typically talking in any deal to a group of other investors that are also looking at that deal. I lean a lot on investors that I like and trust, and I typically won't do an investment unless I've spoken to at least 5 or 10 other investors that have looked at that deal. Some will be doing it, some won't, and I'll at least kind of round out my own analysis with these other people. I mean, Anthony will tell you that I ping him at least once or twice a week to get his opinion on something that's fintech focused, because, you know, he's someone who I want to know what they thought, and I have that with a bunch of other people as well.
Nice. Anthony, how does it look like on your side?
No, I would add to that, and lucky to have Gideon as well too. Sometimes like exchange with Sev, we just don't have as much overlap on the stuff we look at. I think, and it goes back to another thing that was spoken of before. I think, as Gideon said, it is a gut feel decision, but it should be an informed gut feel decision. I think the question is what happens when you're on the fence, meaning you met the 1 in 1,000 founder, you did the quick sprint, you did all your checks, you met the whole team, you know, you're now at the point where you're on the fence. And I think being a solo GP is the purest form of like having to solve with process. And for me at that point, it's a combination of like other investors, but also I have the Rerail advisors who are also like 6 operators that operate at some of the best fintechs in Europe and the US. And they also get incentives from my fund. So that's at that point where they're, by the way, people that have been angel investors and operators, have the benefit of both giving me data points from the bottom up, seeing from the ground, but also have cultivated the muscle of being investors, because like operators can be very opinionated and investors can be very top down. So I tend to kind of rely on them on kind of giving me extra data points. So that meets kind of pinging people like Gideon would get me there, basically.
Yeah, nice. Severin, you flagged in our previous conversations shadow investment committees. Could you elaborate more on that and say a bit, how does it look like on your side, the solo GP decision making?
Yeah, so I don't run that, but what I've done is basically mapped out very systematically my network in the creative industries. So for example, when I look at the music creation tech company, I know very specifically to whom I want to reach out to get feedback on that deal. And that actually, I like the fact, because usually when you're working in a larger investment team, you tend to basically then only talk to your colleagues, and you're less incentivized to get outside references. And I'm kind of forced to get those outside references. I think that the trickier part is actually, and where I have my own bias in a way, usually when you get very excited about the deal, you want that other people are also excited about it, and you have a bit of a tendency that you reach out to people where you feel like they're equally excited. And I think it's quite tricky to reach out to people who might shot at your deal and say, I don't think it's a good deal. I think that bias is something where I feel I have to challenge myself frequently.
Nice. So we've covered raising the fund, we've covered operating the fund, we've covered decision making as a solo GP. Now I want to dig deeper a bit into what is the longer term game and longer term vision for a solo GP. And I want to start with Gideon. You're at 12 million right now as the size of a VC fund. How does the second, third one look like? And does bigger necessarily at some point mean that you need to bring other people on board? And the same question would go to Anthony after that, because you're already at 25. So let's start with Gideon.
Yeah, I mean, I think the equation is simple. The smaller I am, the better I can support founders in the way that I want to, which is to be able to be an early angel-like investor. And that will always be true. So I ideally want to stay as small as possible, and being solo allows me to stay small because I don't have to support through the management fees the salaries of a bigger team. So what are the conditions under which that might change? I think, I would have to find a partner where joining forces was so powerful that expanding the strategy to something that I would say is like suboptimal is worthwhile, because together we can support founders so much better and support many more founders. And so, that bar is very high, and it might or might not ever happen. And I'd be very happy to kind of stay small and solo and support founders the way that I currently do forever.
Nice. Anthony, in your case?
Yeah, so I think there's a disconnect between being a solo GP and bringing other people on board. A good example is someone called Ilad Gil that's like managing billions and is still a solo GP. But if you look underneath the hood, he has a huge team, right? So I think if the question is around being a solo GP, I think it has much more to do about like, do you believe you can bring someone that's so additive that you want them to be owners of your fund as you expand? And for me, like for now, I'm very happy to remain a solo GP, but like as things evolve, if you find that one person, it's something that someone could be open to. But in terms of like fund size and bringing a team on board, or more of a team on board, I think it goes back to the larger the fund, the larger the check size you need to write, the more competitive you need to be, and the larger the coverage you need to take. So like if you say I'm doing global and I need to lead deals, it's quite hard to do that with a one-person team. If you're like a small enough check where vis-a-vis your value add, you believe by yourself you can command the right to kind of win that deal, and you can do a good enough job at like seeing the best entrepreneurs coming from a specific region, then there's no reason to do that. So for me, for now, and I think there is a local maximum, like historically speaking, on what fund size and beyond forces you to have a check size that's large enough that probably you need to start leading deals. That is shifting and changing because AI is making everything bigger, including round sizes and hopefully outcome sizes. But there is a local maximum, at least empirically speaking.
Yeah, two things here come to mind. I mean, first, what we're seeing with AI allows many founders to start solo companies, and we clearly see this is happening also with solo GPs. You mentioned yourself, Claude. We heard about Gemini. I mean, these tools are leveraging more and more of your efforts. Another thing that I'm just thinking out loud is having in mind the fact that you're already coming from VC funds where you had multiple GPs means that now when you're solo, there's basically no rush for you to add additional partners unless you, as Gideon said, you see like a very good match and a very good reason to have that person on board.
And maybe it's my experience, and I know we don't have too much time, but like in my experience, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like early stage venture is a lonely job regardless. Like even if you're in partnerships, there's very few partnerships. Because like the job is go find great founders and support great founders and then pitch it to the rest of the team. So the extension of your team becomes other operators or other VCs by design, no matter.
Yeah, and you touched you want to touch something?
No, I agree with that. That's fine.
Yeah, I wanted to go into something that Anthony actually now just touched upon, is the psychology of being a solo GP. And you mentioned loneliness, basically. What do you guys would say are the hardest parts as being a solo GP? And is there the loneliness part? Like not in the sense like I feel lonely, but in the sense of you do not have another 1 or 2 or 3 GPs around you to run all of these decisions with, or to go through the hard moments with. How do you deal with these things, and what are the hard moments, actually? We can start with Anthony, as you touched upon that.
I think that like being solo actually like pushes you to make the controversial decisions, helps you to not rely on other people to revert to the mean. And so like if you have the right processes to do that, I think you can be better off. It does get, I think, lonely in a traditional sense in places like when you're on the fence with a deal like we just discussed before. Maybe I give one example where I think for me it felt more that, which is relatively recent, which was a portfolio company of mine, which I invested in an angel round, which means there was no other bigger Czech investor than me, is struggling and wanted to go through a process of M&A. And so like you're one person that's supporting all of these portfolio companies and suddenly you have to support these people. And I think that's felt lonely more because it's not a muscle I've cultivated per se. But then you realize, again, going back to the extension of your team, like I have a few of my institutional LPs that have arms that have institutionalized that. And now there's two of my LPs that have corp dev teams that are supporting that team full on. So it forces you to be creative and solve with process, but it can get lonely sometimes.
Severin, parts and psychology of being solo.
Yeah, I'd rather say it's the emotional highs and lows. Of course, there is a lot of them. It's less about workload or being alone in the home office in Vienna, in my case. It's more like sharing those kind of emotional moments, either positive or also negative. And I mean, one specific example, I hosted an investors founder dinner in Paris like 2 years ago or so, and it was a great success. But after the dinner was finished, I just went back to the hotel all by myself. There was no kind of like celebrating the little moments in a way. And these are moments where you feel like, okay, shit, I'd love to have like a colleague or a partner, have a beer and just talk about it. I called my wife, she's a clinical psychologist, that helps. But these are the tricky moments, I'd say.
Nice. Gideon?
Yeah, for me, the hard part is the juggling. It's you're fundraising, you're sourcing, you're diligencing, you're convincing founders to take your money, that you're helping your portfolio founders, you're managing the business and the fund. So that juggling is tough. Loneliness is an interesting one. Because we get asked about it all the time. I spent almost a decade helping build startups, like companies, and then I went to work for a big venture fund, and that transition felt lonely because it felt like going from playing a team sport to playing an individual sport. Like building a company is a team sport. You've got cross-functional teams of people that are fully dependent on each other, whereas going to work at a fund, you're spending 95% of your time by yourself. And the transition from the fund to being a solo GP in many ways felt less lonely because I was collaborating so much more with other investors. So so in many ways I've kind of felt like I've gone back to being more collaborative by being solo in a somewhat ironic way.
I love that. Well, we've covered how these guys decided to get into the solo GP game. We covered how you raise one, operate one, fund, decide what is the long game, how does it look like. And we're running out of time, so we're going to wrap it up with one last question, rapid one to all three of you. Like in the beginning, when I asked about who plans to do that, who plans to do this, on the solo GP question, there were a couple of people here. So after this panel, we either rose up the numbers and like more people are going to like to be solo GPs, or less, like even these people here will be like, oh no, it sucks. So if you have one piece of advice for people that want to become solo GPs, what would it be? Let's start with Anthony.
I think you need to be obsessed by the craft of venture, and you need to feel like you have an edge you can bring to the table to founders that's differentiated, because the journey is going to be freaking hard, and it is a competitive sport. So,
nice. Severin?
Thinking about distribution, I think it's the same what I tell to startup founders, because most founders usually underestimate the distribution go-to-market angle. And it's the same being a solo GP, that you can't think enough about how do you distribute this to LPs, to your kind of customers at the end of the day. If you take the deliberate decision to go solo, make sure you know who are your LPs going to be.
Nice. Gideon?
Maybe just more tactically, I think give yourself a time. Every single person told me it was going to take 2 years, and I didn't believe them, which created a lot of stress for myself, and it landed up taking 2 years. So make sure you've got 2 years, basically.
Thank you guys for the great conversation. Thank you for being with us. Big round of applause for Anthony, Severin, and Gideon.